Across the globe, certain stories remain underreported despite their staggering implications. These are stories of corruption, exploitation, and societal harm that are woven into the very fabric of modern civilization. From the alarming number of missing children to the corporate interests that dominate governments, these narratives reveal a darker side of our world. This series delves into 10 unsettling truths, offering a closer look at the uncomfortable realities many prefer to ignore. Each story reflects how deeply intertwined human suffering can be with the systems and institutions meant to protect and serve society. Global missing children crisis. Imagine the terror of waking up one morning to find your child missing. Now imagine that happening to 8 million families every year around the globe. The global crisis of missing children is a stark and sobering reality, with most cases occurring in underdeveloped regions where law enforcement and social safety nets are weak. Many of these children never come home, vanishing into the shadows of human trafficking, forced labor, or exploitation rings that span countries and continents. At the heart of this issue is the transnational nature of child trafficking networks. Traffickers operate in multiple countries, often using false documentation and corrupt border officials to transport children undetected. These operations are highly coordinated, making it difficult for law enforcement to track the movement of victims. A child can be abducted from Southeast Asia, sold in the Middle East, and trafficked into forced labor in Europe within weeks. The lack of international cooperation exacerbates the problem. While some countries have stringent anti-trafficking laws, others lag far behind, creating safe havens for traffickers. One of the biggest hurdles is the disparity in legal definitions and enforcement. What constitutes missing or trafficked varies widely from one country to another, making it difficult to create a cohesive global response. Organizations like Interpol and Missing Children International attempt to bridge these gaps, but they are often understaffed and underfunded compared to the scale of the problem. Meanwhile, families are left in limbo, often with no support from their governments. The technological advances that could help locate missing children are often inaccessible to poorer nations. In wealthier countries, systems like Amber Alerts and extensive CCTV coverage can quickly mobilize resources, but in conflict zones or impoverished regions, missing children are more likely to fall through the cracks. The situation is even worse in countries plagued by war, famine, or political instability, where children are especially vulnerable to abduction by local militias or criminal organizations. The consequences of this crisis are devastating. Many missing children are sold into sex slavery, used as child soldiers, or forced into grueling labor under life-threatening conditions. The trauma inflicted on these children, many of whom are never found, is immeasurable. While international efforts to combat child trafficking have intensified in recent years, the scale of the problem demands far more attention and resources than it currently receives. Governments and underworld connections. In some parts of the world, the line between government and organized crime is not just blurred, it's often non-existent. In countries like Mexico and Italy, crime syndicates have infiltrated the highest levels of political power, transforming democratically elected governments into puppets for their own nefarious interests. These relationships are not born overnight, but rather from decades of systemic corruption, greed, and the insatiable appetite for power and profit. In Mexico, drug cartels such as Sinaloa and Los Zetas wield immense influence over local and national governments. These cartels have an economic hold on entire regions, where the drug trade often becomes the primary source of income for local populations. Government officials, police forces, and even military personnel are frequently bought off, allowing cartels to operate with near impunity. In return, the cartels fund political campaigns, ensure loyalty through fear or bribery, and even execute rivals to protect their interests. This symbiotic relationship is not limited to developing nations. In Italy, the mafia has been a shadow government for decades. Groups like the Cosa Nostra in Sicily and Camorra in Naples have deeply entrenched themselves in the political landscape. These mafias control lucrative industries, from construction to waste management, by rigging government contracts and securing political favors through bribery and intimidation. The result is a governance system where the lines between legal authority and criminal power are indistinguishable. One of the most telling examples of this interplay between government and organized crime is the Maxi trial of the 1980s in Italy, where hundreds of mafia members were prosecuted in what was seen as a major crackdown on organized crime. However, while the trial resulted in numerous convictions, it revealed how deeply the mafia had infiltrated political institutions, with many high-ranking officials found to be complicit. The problem is systemic. Corruption, fueled by the enormous profits generated by illicit activities like drug trafficking, prostitution, and arms smuggling, creates an environment where crime becomes institutionalized. These connections erode public trust in government and undermine the rule of law, leading to societies where crime syndicates essentially control the state. Efforts to sever these ties are ongoing, but the challenge is monumental. Breaking the link between governments and organized crime requires not just legal reform, but a cultural shift in how power is wielded and accountability is enforced. Modern-day slavery. Though many associate slavery with a bygone era, the brutal reality is that it continues to thrive in the 21st century. More than 50 million people live in conditions of modern-day slavery, trapped in forced labor, sex trafficking, or debt bondage. From the cocoa plantations of West Africa to the factories of Southeast Asia, modern slavery is a pervasive yet often hidden element of the global economy. A significant portion of this modern slavery exists in global supply chains that fuel industries like fashion, agriculture, and technology. Companies often outsource production to countries where labor laws are weak or unenforced, allowing exploitation to flourish under the radar. Workers in these regions, often children or migrants, are forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions for little or no pay. In many cases, they are held captive by threats, violence, or insurmountable debts that bind them to their employers indefinitely. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, children as young as 7 are forced to work in hazardous mines extracting cobalt, a mineral essential for the production of smartphones and electric car batteries. Despite global awareness of these abuses, the demand for cheap labor ensures the continuation of these practices. Even in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, instances of human trafficking and forced labor are not uncommon, with migrants and vulnerable populations often targeted. Combating modern slavery is no easy feat. It requires international cooperation, stringent labor laws, and most importantly, enforcement. Many governments have adopted anti-trafficking laws, but corruption and lack of resources often hinder their application. The International Labour Organization and NGOs like Anti-Slavery International are working to address these issues, but they face an uphill battle against powerful economic interests that benefit from the exploitation of vulnerable workers. The rise of ethical consumerism has brought some attention to the issue, with more people questioning the origins of their products. However, until there are substantial changes in both corporate practices and government oversight, modern slavery will continue to be a dark undercurrent of the global economy. Big Pharma's profit-driven focus. The pharmaceutical industry, often lauded for its life-saving medications, has a darker side that is less frequently discussed. Big Pharma, as it's colloquially known, has been accused of prioritizing profit over patient well-being by expanding the definition of treatable illnesses, a practice known as disease-mongering. This tactic involves transforming normal life experiences, such as aging or mild anxiety, into conditions requiring pharmaceutical treatment. Take Viagra, for example. Originally developed to treat erectile dysfunction, its success led to a dramatic rise in the medicalization of sexual performance issues, a problem that was once considered a natural part of aging. The same pattern has been observed in other areas such as depression, anxiety, and even ADHD. Conditions that were once considered mild or manageable without medication are now treated as chronic illnesses, with lifelong prescriptions often being the result. This shift has led to the overprescription of medications, contributing to growing rates of drug dependency and side effects. Antidepressants are a prime example, with millions of people worldwide taking these medications despite debates about their long-term efficacy and safety. Critics argue that while these drugs can be life-saving for some, they are overprescribed, particularly in cases where non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as therapy or lifestyle changes, could be equally effective. The driving force behind this trend is the pharmaceutical industry's profit motive. Drug companies spend billions each year on marketing, not just to doctors but also directly to consumers through advertisements. This direct-to-consumer advertising, legal only in the United States and New Zealand, encourages patients to ask their doctors for specific drugs, often without fully understanding the risks or benefits. Moreover, pharmaceutical companies have been found guilty of manipulating clinical trials, withholding negative results, and promoting off-label uses for their drugs. This manipulation leads to the approval and widespread use of medications that may not be as safe or effective as initially claimed. While the industry has undoubtedly made significant advancements in medicine, the question remains, at what cost? Music industry's ties to private prisons. The private prison industry in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, profiting from the incarceration of millions of people, many of whom come from marginalized communities. What's even more unsettling are the alleged connections between this industry and the music industry, specifically in genres like hip-hop, which has long been criticized for glamorizing violence and criminal behavior. According to various sources, some investors who hold stakes in private prisons also have financial interests in the music industry. The theory suggests that by promoting music that glorifies illegal activities, these investors are essentially encouraging the behavior that leads to incarceration, thus ensuring a steady stream of inmates for their prisons. While there is no concrete proof to fully support these claims, the idea raises important questions about the influence of media on behavior, especially among vulnerable youth. Hip-hop, a genre born out of social struggle, has historically served as a voice for marginalized communities. However, in recent decades, the commercialization of the genre has led to the propagation of certain themes that critics argue are damaging to the communities from which the genre originated. Lyrics that glorify violence, drug dealing, and gang life are pervasive in mainstream hip-hop, despite the fact that many artists use these themes as a reflection of the harsh realities they've experienced. This raises an important question. If certain investors profit both from the incarceration of young men and the promotion of music that celebrates criminal lifestyles, is there a deeper agenda at play? While concrete evidence is lacking, the private prison industry's profit-driven model incentivizes the perpetuation of high incarceration rates. Music that subtly or overtly encourages behaviors leading to crime may inadvertently contribute to this cycle. The broader context is that private prisons have been shown to profit enormously from high inmate populations, and the criminal justice system in the United States disproportionately targets minority communities. African Americans and Latinos, who make up a large portion of hip-hop's audience, are also disproportionately represented in prison populations. This convergence of interests, even if indirect, warrants deeper investigation into how cultural influences may be manipulated for profit. Prisons as profit centers. Private prisons in the United States represent a multi-billion-dollar industry that profits directly from the number of inmates they house. Unlike public institutions, private prisons have a financial incentive to keep beds full. The more people incarcerated, the more money these companies make, often leading to perverse incentives that prioritize profit over rehabilitation and justice. CoreCivic and GEO Group, two of the largest private prison operators in the US, have been at the center of numerous scandals related to prisoner abuse, neglect, and substandard living conditions. These companies, which contract with state and federal governments, often cut corners to maximize profits, leading to overcrowded facilities, inadequate medical care, and rampant human rights violations. One of the most concerning aspects of the private prison system is its role in lobbying for tougher laws and longer sentences. These companies actively lobby lawmakers to pass legislation that ensures a steady influx of inmates. For example, they have pushed for harsher drug laws and three-strike sentencing policies that disproportionately affect minority communities. In this way, private prisons fuel mass incarceration, particularly of Black and Latino men, and profit directly from the overcriminalization of low-level offenses. This business model incentivizes policies that favor punishment over rehabilitation, making it harder for inmates to reintegrate into society. With minimal investment in rehabilitation programs, education, or vocational training, private prisons are set up to fail inmates who are expected to re-enter society without the tools necessary for success. Instead of reducing recidivism, the system keeps the cycle of imprisonment spinning, ensuring a continued flow of profits for the companies involved. The ethics of privatized incarceration have been widely debated, but as long as the financial incentives remain, the interests of private prison corporations will likely continue to align with the perpetuation of mass incarceration. The legal sex industry's dark side. While the legalization of prostitution in some countries is intended to protect sex workers by giving them legal rights and safer working conditions, it has often resulted in an unexpected and troubling consequence: an increase in human trafficking. Countries such as Germany and the Netherlands, where prostitution is legal and regulated, have seen a rise in human trafficking cases as criminal organizations exploit legal loopholes to traffic women and children into forced sex work. Legalized prostitution is meant to give sex workers autonomy, allowing them to work in safer environments and access legal protections that illegal sex workers cannot. However, the legal framework has created opportunities for traffickers to operate more freely. By posing as legal sex workers or operating under the guise of legitimate brothels, traffickers can move their victims with relative ease. Once inside the system, these victims, many of whom are migrants or vulnerable individuals, find it nearly impossible to escape. Authorities in countries with legalized prostitution struggle to differentiate between voluntary sex work and trafficking. This creates a significant blind spot in law enforcement, allowing traffickers to evade capture and continue their operations largely unchecked. In addition, the legalization of prostitution has led to a rise in sex tourism, where men from other countries travel to engage in legal sex work, often unaware or indifferent to the fact that they may be contributing to human trafficking. The issue is compounded by the reluctance of victims to come forward. Many trafficked individuals fear retaliation from their traffickers or deportation by the authorities, making them unwilling to seek help. The overlap between legal sex work and trafficking has blurred the lines, making it difficult for governments to adequately address the human rights abuses occurring within this industry. Despite international efforts to combat trafficking, the problem persists, particularly in countries with legalized sex work. While legalization is intended to protect sex workers, it has inadvertently provided cover for traffickers to exploit the most vulnerable, perpetuating a cycle of abuse and exploitation. Cheating is legal, but destructive. Infidelity is legal in most countries, but its consequences can be devastating. While laws focus on property, custody, and divorce settlements, the emotional toll that cheating takes on individuals and families is often overlooked. Adultery can lead to severe emotional distress, depression, anxiety, and in extreme cases, even suicide. The personal devastation caused by infidelity underscores the gap between legal permissibility and moral accountability. Marriage is often viewed as a social contract, and when one partner breaks that contract, the repercussions ripple through not only the couple but also their children and extended families. Trust is shattered, and the psychological trauma can linger for years. Despite the deep emotional damage, most legal systems do not impose penalties for infidelity unless it directly impacts financial settlements or child custody arrangements in cases of divorce. This legal indifference to cheating reflects a broader societal trend of minimizing the personal consequences of infidelity. Unlike in earlier centuries, where adultery could result in criminal punishment or public shame, today's laws treat it as a private matter. However, the effects are far from private. Studies show that individuals who experience infidelity are more likely to suffer from long-term emotional distress, and the children of unfaithful parents often bear the brunt of the fallout, experiencing behavioral issues, academic struggles, and trust issues in their own relationships. In some cases, the trauma of infidelity has driven individuals to suicide. Betrayal by a trusted partner can lead to feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, and despair, particularly if the relationship was long-term or involved children. While cheating may be legally permissible, its destructive consequences are far-reaching, affecting not only the individuals involved, but the fabric of their communities and families. Corporate lobbying dominates governments. In many countries, particularly in the United States, corporate lobbying plays an outsized role in shaping government policy. Industries such as pharmaceuticals, oil, and food spend billions of dollars each year to influence lawmakers, often resulting in policies that prioritize corporate profits over public welfare. This system of corporate lobbying has become so entrenched that it now drives much of the legislative process, with devastating effects on social, economic, and environmental justice. Pharmaceutical companies, for example, have long lobbied against measures to lower drug prices, ensuring that medications remain prohibitively expensive for millions of people. Similarly, oil companies have successfully lobbied for deregulation and subsidies, allowing them to continue polluting the environment without paying the true cost of their actions. These efforts have contributed to the rise of environmental degradation, health disparities, and economic inequality across the country. Lobbying allows corporations to shape policy in ways that benefit their bottom line, often at the expense of the public. For instance, when Monsanto lobbied for lax regulations on pesticides, it effectively shielded itself from accountability for the environmental damage caused by its products. This type of influence distorts the democratic process, as corporate money drowns out the voices of ordinary citizens who cannot afford to hire lobbyists or donate to political campaigns. The impact of corporate lobbying extends beyond environmental issues. It affects nearly every facet of public life, from healthcare to education to workers' rights. Corporations have lobbied to weaken labor laws, making it easier for companies to exploit their workers and harder for unions to protect employees. Similarly, the food industry has lobbied against public health initiatives such as anti-obesity campaigns to protect their profits. As long as corporate lobbying remains a key component of the political system, the interests of ordinary citizens will continue to take a back seat to those of powerful industries. Mental health drugs overprescribed. The over-medicalization of mental health has created a culture where the first line of treatment is often a pill, rather than addressing the root causes of emotional or psychological distress. This trend has been exacerbated by aggressive marketing from pharmaceutical companies, which often promote drugs for conditions that may not even require medication. For example, mild anxiety or temporary sadness, which may once have been seen as normal parts of life, are now frequently diagnosed as disorders requiring treatment with antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs. This approach risks pathologizing normal human emotions, turning common reactions to stress, grief, or disappointment into medical conditions. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, the authoritative guide used by psychiatrists to diagnose mental health conditions, has expanded its definitions over time, allowing for more diagnoses and, in turn, more prescriptions. This has been criticized for benefiting pharmaceutical companies by creating a larger market for psychotropic drugs. Doctors, too, are not immune to this trend. Many medical professionals, influenced by pharmaceutical representatives and the perceived quick-fix solution of medication, may prescribe drugs without fully exploring alternative therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, mindfulness techniques, and lifestyle changes are often underutilized in favor of medications that can offer faster but potentially less sustainable relief. This reliance on medications can lead to dependency, as patients who use drugs to manage their symptoms may struggle to wean off them, or find that the medications become less effective over time, necessitating higher doses or additional drugs to manage side effects. The consequences of overprescribing psychotropic drugs are significant. Long-term use of antidepressants and antipsychotics can lead to a host of side effects, including weight gain, sexual dysfunction, and an increased risk of developing diabetes or heart disease. There is also evidence to suggest that, in some cases, long-term use of antidepressants may actually increase the risk of relapse, creating a cycle of dependency that benefits pharmaceutical companies but does little to help patients achieve true mental well-being. Ultimately, the overprescription of mental health drugs reflects a broader issue within the healthcare system, a focus on treating symptoms rather than addressing the underlying causes of distress. Until there is a shift toward a more holistic, patient-centered approach to mental health care, one that prioritizes non-pharmaceutical interventions and considers the social, economic, and environmental factors contributing to mental illness, the problem of over-medicalization is likely to persist. Conclusion. These 10 stories illustrate the deep and often hidden complexities of our world, issues that intertwine human suffering with systems of power, profit, and exploitation. From the tragic disappearance of millions of children to the insidious ties between corporations, governments, and private prisons, these narratives reveal how deeply rooted corruption and unethical practices are in our global systems. Whether through the exploitation of modern-day slaves or the medicalization of our everyday experiences, these issues demand urgent attention. Yet addressing them requires more than just awareness. It requires systemic change, a re-evaluation of our priorities, and a commitment to justice for the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for spending time with us through Spookscope today. Feel free to share your knowledge and wisdom in the comment section below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.